All right, welcome everybody to another very special episode of the Mike Sennello Show. Tonight's interview is going to be with Board of Finance candidate Joe DeGregorio. He'll be joining us momentarily. Before we get started, just wanted to give everybody a recap of things. We interviewed Pete Bass last week on Wednesday night. We interviewed, our Board of Education candidate, Eric Hansel, Sunday night. We interviewed last night Diane Clafe. Apologies for the technical difficulties. Hopefully we won't run into them tonight. I have actually, I was recording that interview, so I've actually put that up on my YouTube and Facebook channel. So if you guys are watching at home on YouTube, you can go ahead and just look into that playlist. If you're watching on YouTube, you can just go onto my videos and you can see my interview with Board of Finance candidate Diane Clafe. If you're watching at home on Facebook, again, you can go to my Facebook page. It's Michael Sennello, and where I've re-uploaded that video. You can watch the original one, which is broken, or you can watch the one that I re-uploaded, the recording of that video, which is not broken. So just so people know, we're going to cap off this week of interviews on Thursday night with Town Councilman Sal Rankowitz. And tomorrow night, so people know, is the Board of Education the PTO's Meet the Board of Education Candidates event at Sarah Noble Intermediate School. So that's where I will be, and that's going to be 7 p.m. Again, we are still working on some other candidates that we're going to nail down hopefully in just a few days for Sunday night and for Wednesday night. If we don't get an interview on Sunday night, then we'll just do the normal show like we've done before. So last thing before we get started, we are streaming to YouTube. We are streaming to Facebook. If you'd rather watch on YouTube and you're watching on Facebook, the link is in this video's description. Same thing if you're watching on YouTube, you can join in on Facebook too. And with that said, we are going to have, as we always do with these live interviews, live Q&A. So that is your chance to engage with the candidate directly. If there are questions you have of the candidate, then get them in now before you forget, and I'll read them at the end of our interview. That's how we cap all of these things. I've talked about why we do that, and it'll be obvious when we get into our interview, which tonight, like I mentioned, thanks for everyone for joining in, is going to be with Board of Finance candidate Joe DeGregorio. So without further ado, let's pull in our guest. Joe, thanks for coming in.
Mike. Oh, hey, Mike.
Hey, Joe. So, Joe, we're going to start off with the same question that we ask everybody here, because like I've said before, if I said it one time, I've said it 100 times. I want to introduce people to the person before we really get into the candidate. So, Joe, the same question we ask everybody: what brought you to New Milford?
A car. No, I'm not funny either. The dad jokes run thick. It was actually, I traveled all around the country in my 20s, and my wife is from the area. She grew up in New Fairfield. I grew up in North Salem, which isn't far away, right over the border in New York. And we wanted to go to school, and this was a great place. We liked the downtown. It reminded us of the previous places that we'd lived. We lived in like St. Augustine, Florida, and some places in Colorado and Wyoming and all over the place. We really fell in love with the downtown. And then over the years of living here, went from Naugatuck Valley Community College to Western Connecticut State University. And then right after college, my wife got pregnant and we settled down here because we loved the town so much. And eventually I started a couple of businesses here and then went back to school. And yeah, here I am.
Yeah. So your journey is actually kind of an interesting journey in many ways. And we'll get into the political journey. But Joe, if you want to just quickly elucidate people on what your journey has taken you through in terms of your career, because you said you did go to university, and then you started working for somebody, then you started working for yourself, and now you're working for somebody again. So, yeah. so let's hear just a brief version of that history.
So I'm a serial entrepreneur, and I've owned a few different construction businesses over the years, as well as for a short period of time, I ran an online music store. I actually went to school for finance and business management. I double majored. And when I got out, it was in 2012. I applied at a whole bunch of different places. And with my wife being pregnant, I needed to make some quick bucks. So I was basically like handymanning it, and I was doing so well at that I just decided to, go all in and start the business. And in 2013, I started Joe Fix It, and I did that from then until actually March 2020. In between there, I did in 2015 get my Series 6 and my 63 and my life accident health and my property and casualty licenses, and I worked for Prudential and then People's United Bank as a licensed investment associate. But I was just doing so well with the handyman and the construction stuff that that was way more lucrative until I hurt my back in I think it was 2018, the fall of 2018. I had surgery on my shoulder, and then in 2019 I really kind of messed up my back and pinched a bunch of nerves, and just realized that I was getting a little bit older. And through college, and then again, being laid up and being hurt, I was learning to code. So through COVID, I actually took an online course and got a certificate in software engineering, and now I work for Infosys.
That's very cool. That's a really cool journey, and for me in particular, that's incredibly relatable as somebody who's been in, I'll call it the trades, who's been in manual labor for so long, and like you start to see the toll that it takes on your body, and you try to branch life. Basically, it's God's way of telling you it's time to find a new career, and that you can't do this stuff forever.
One of the best pieces of advice I was given, and I probably should have listened a little bit harder at the time, was one of the old guys when I was in my 20s. Actually, right after I started my first business, which was DeGregorio Stone and Tile LLC. We were a granite tile and marble company. I did granite tile and marble installations and fabricated granite countertops. And that's really, really, really hard on your body. I mean, on your lungs, breathing in all the dust, the fabrication side, but then also you're carrying
these heavy, these really heavy
500-pound pieces of rock into people's houses. And one of the old timers that I worked with was like, you got to get out of the truck by the time you're 40. And I didn't really realize what that meant until I turned 40. So
yeah. So now that you're over 40, I mean, it sounds like you spent a good part of what you would describe as the most important parts of your life. You moved here with your wife, you got your education in the area. You started a family. Did you actually marry your wife here while you were here, or were you married before you came here?
I got married in 2002. So I've been married since I was 21.
Very cool.
Yeah. So, so I've been married a long time. We did settle here and buy a house and all that sort of stuff, and have all of my kids have only ever really known, this town. So.
Yeah. So, I mean, vested interest here. So speaking of that vested interest, then what made you want to get into the leap into town government, into politics in general?
Well, it started kind of, as settling here, I wanted to get involved and give back to the community, because most of my education was actually done on grant funding. I kept my GPA super high, and as a result, I kept getting scholarships and grant money from the state and from the colleges and stuff. So I just wanted to give back, and having kids, I mean, I wasn't going out and partying with my buddies and playing in metal bands anymore. So, I had to do something to occupy myself. So I actually initially tried to reach out. I was a registered Democrat at the time. I tried to reach out to the Democratic Town Committee. I remember seeing Bob Gambino down at the bottom of the hill on 109 right next to Duncan.
Former mayor, yep.
Yeah, and he was putting up a sign, and I was like, I stopped and I was like, hey, I want to get involved. I'm a Democrat. Let me help you guys out. And they gave me a card. I'm like, oh, you got to come to one of the meetings. And so I called, and there was no response. And after doing that for a couple of months, I saw in the Spectrum that Mayor Pat Murphy had put out, looking for people for boards and commissions. And I was like, well, I don't really need to be part of a committee. What I really want to do is give back to the community. So I went in and I talked to her, and she's like, well, where do you think you would be good? And I actually, at first I was thinking, put me on, I don't know, roads or facilities, something, or, because I was working in construction, and I kind of figured that was really my biggest tool set. And she was like, you have a degree in finance. She's like, would you be interested in being an alternate and just seeing what it's like? It's, once a month. It's not really a huge commitment, but you could see if you get your feet wet, and we'll talk about it after that. And I got into it, and I really kind of enjoyed it, because it was a part of my brain that I never, really got to use. I mean, throughout most of the day, when you're putting trim up on a wall or something like that, I mean, you're doing some basic math, but you're not really, no real hard thought there. So this was kind of a nice way to, get into it and get involved. And especially during budget season, I started, I think, right before the 2014, 2015. Is that what it was? I think it was 2014, 2015 budget cycle. So one of the first meetings I went to, she handed me this big stack. I don't know if anyone's ever seen
it's intimidating.
Books, but it's like, and it was the older ones.
Yep.
Not the
no,
newer
I'm familiar
ones.
with them. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was a huge stack. And I remember going home and going like, what am I even going to do with all this, and sitting through all the budget hearings and all that sort of stuff was, very disorienting, to be honest with you. It was a little bit of culture shock. But eventually I kind of really did a little bit of homework and read up on the charter and all that sort of stuff, and kind of figured out where the role was of the Board of Finance. And then ran for election in 2015 as a Democrat and won a seat.
On the Board of Finance.
On the Board of Finance, yeah.
Where you currently sit now. You've served on other boards and commissions, and I want to get into them in just a moment. But
I did, but Mike, I want to be clear. I'm just an alternate right now, so I actually haven't. Aside from the last meeting and then a couple of web meetings throughout the past year and like budget hearings, I haven't really been an active member for probably about the last year. So
yeah, so we're going to get into the difference between seated members, alternates, elected members. Appointed members. We're going to get into that in just a minute.
Yep.
so that people understand the difference between the two, because the Board of Finance isn't like the town council that tends to attract the attention of people. Like we mentioned in the Diane Clafe interview, with the town council, everyone who's elected to the town council is elected to a perfectly equal seat. So there aren't appointed seats, there aren't alternate seats. So it's a little bit different. We're going to get into that in just a minute.
You can be appointed to town council if there's a vacancy.
Well, kind of.
And that was a point of contention in the charter revision,
which we're going to get into.
Yeah.
So bear with me here, Joe. So real quick, the other boards and commissions that you served on, I want to get into that next. But real quick, since you were on the Board of Finance in 2014 was your first foray into the Board of Finance?
Yeah, I think it was 2014. I'd actually have to look back at a calendar. I'm pretty sure that's what it was. Yeah.
Okay, and then
I was elected in 2015 to start in 2016, and then it expired in 2020.
Correct. Yeah. So you were successfully elected as a Democrat in 2015. Have you been continuously serving on the Board of Finance as an alternate or an elected member?
Yeah. I've continuously been on the Board of Finance. Yeah.
So that's interesting. So you're actually, we should probably get some of this out of the way. This is actually where I met Joe, was around 2015, 2016, just so people understand where the two of us sit as a relationship, because I'm sure that there might be some inclination towards impropriety with, how we're going to treat each other with an interview like this. Joe, just give people a history on, just a real brief history on our relationship, where we've met and, how we've carried ourselves.
So I think that probably the first time I remember like talking to you and watching you speak was I think it was either at a budget hearing or something regarding Pettibone School, and you talked so fast. It was like almost hard for me to like I had to like actively focus on what you were saying to get all the words in. And I remember that, and that was kind of it. I mean, like really, that's the first time I remember. And then I think we had a couple of political conversations, but really, I think you've always been, a little bit more libertarian than me. And yeah, mostly around town council meetings and such. I mean, that's,
yeah, but it's not like, yeah, no, Joe and I have had conversations online. We actually have a debate. If you guys are watching us on YouTube, Joe and I did have, we'll call it a conversation on intellectual property, which I thought was an interesting conversation. I'm calling it a conversation because I guess you could frame it as a debate, but I kind of was a fence sitter that entire conversation. So, so Joe and I have had these conversations before. Joe and I are very familiar with each other. But just so folks know, it's not like I'm working on his campaign or anything like that. It's not like I've given him necessarily an endorsement, even though he's been a co-host a guest co-host for one of our episodes too.
Yeah, that was a thing. I actually thought that this would be, if I was co-hosting any sort of political podcast, it would kind of be an election speed bump in terms of like campaign finance and all that sort of stuff. I mean, so,
yeah.
So I kind of, that was really on me. I didn't want to, put the RTC in an odd position where they either had to endorse the show or I had to form a separate, finance committee for a Board of Finance run. I didn't really feel that was something that I wanted to do. It's a lot of work and a lot of record keeping and filing and
Yeah, this is just kind of a disclaimer we have to get out of the way so that
Sure.
people understand, where things stand with the two of us in case there's any accusations of impropriety going on here. But we talked about your journey through your career. We talked about your journey through life, moving to New Milford and through into the Board of Finances. I'd love to hear. Hopefully, at the end, maybe we'll circle back to the other boards and commissions that you've served on, because Joe and I actually did serve together on the board. You mentioned your experience with facilities. We served on the Facilities Utilization Committee.
Yep. I also served with Diane Clafe on the Charter Revision Commission.
And we're going to get to that. Trust me. Trust me, Joe. So let's talk about now your journey, because people are going to bring this up and it's going to be talked about, and whatever needs to be said about it, I don't want to hear for the horse's mouth. Let's talk about your journey through the political parties, because you ran in 2015 as a Democrat for the Board of Finance and were elected as a Democrat. Now you're running as a Republican on the RTC ticket for the same seat. Now, as I understand, you didn't go straight from Democrat to Republican, so let's hear that journey.
All right.
In your own words.
This is in my own words. And I'm trying to think of the easiest way to explain it is that I'm not really any one political party. I don't look at any one political party and see like, wow, I align with them 100% on absolutely all of their ideas. And I had a little bit of trouble with the local DTC. I mean, they especially with the previous mayor, David Gronbach, we had a little bit of a tiff regarding the landfill settlement fund, and then he created a white paper, and there's a whole bunch of backstory there. I don't know if you want to get into it.
If we have time, we will.
Yeah.
If we have time, we will.
Sure. But I decided I didn't really want to be a Democrat after the primaries for the 2016. Was it 2016 elections?
Yeah. 2016 would have been a national and state election.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember
state offices.
It must have been 16 because I was actually on the Board of Finance at the time. 16, and then Trump was elected. He actually started in 17, right? So it must have been the spring of 2016. I was actually a delegate. I was so involved with the party. I was a delegate to the state convention to nominate Hillary Clinton, which I wasn't 100% behind. My district, the 67th district, actually in the primary voted for Bernie Sanders, and there was a little bit of back and forth that way. But even at the convention, I mean, people were pushing for unanimous vote and all this sort of stuff, and I didn't really feel that was appropriate in any sort of democratic or representative sense, because like my district voted for a particular candidate. It's my duty as a representative or a delegate to vote for him. But after a bunch of the turmoil with some of the stuff with the DTC, I then decided to run for town council, and I wanted to run independent, but I didn't really know which way I was going. So I spent a lot of time on the computer looking at Nolan charts and where do I sit politically. And it was always Libertarian, Green Party, that sort of thing. So I tried to start a Green Party because I actually really like the 4 pillars of the International Green Party. Grassroots democracy and social justice and some stuff like that. I really thought they were some really good ideas. And I liked the openness and the democratic nature of it. But after the 2016 election, I found that the party itself was really kind of pushing its way more and more and more towards the radical left, which is not really a place where I'm super comfortable. I tend to be a little bit more moderate. So I just decided to drop that. And trying to get a party started in the town was very, very difficult. I mean, you have to have a certain number of people show up to a certain number of meetings, and everything has to be recorded and has to be within a certain time frame, and you have to send it to the state. Otherwise, you have to continuously go through this process in order to get ballot access, which really, I think that's probably one of the biggest things. I mean, if we could expand this is probably a whole nother sidebar, right?
Yeah,
if we could expand ballot access and make people able to get on the ballot a little bit easier. We really could expand the number of people who I think would run for office outside of political parties, because it doesn't cost a lot to run for a town seat. You ran for town council. I mean, you don't have to throw a whole bunch of money at it. Getting on the ballot was a little tough, and you got to be active and knock on doors, but it's not the end of the world. So I found myself after that, still serving on the Board of Finance with an unsuccessful campaign for town council, really talking to the Republicans. I mean, it was really, by default more than by design. I would reach out to the Democrats. I kept trying to keep in contact with them and, reach out to people who were on the boards and commissions and have conversations with them, but they didn't answer the phone. I mean, that's the God's honest truth, I mean, I would call Pete Bass and he'd answer, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I'd see Paul Szymanski and he'd shake my hand in the hallway, or see him at Dunkin' Donuts and we'd chat for a minute, where I kind of found the Democrats would, turn and walk the other way, I mean, maybe I made myself a little bit caustic. I really don't know. I mean, but I just found myself there more and more and more. And when they asked me to run for this cycle, I was like, yeah, okay, I'll run, I mean, not to be nonchalant about it. I did think about it, but it wasn't because I'm like, oh my God, I'm a Trump Republican or something like that. It was just,
so it sounds to me your rationale for running as a Republican this time around and on the RTC ticket is the same rationale that I have for attending the RTC meetings and not attending the DTC meetings. And that is, they invited me. The RTC invited me, so I go.
Nicer. I mean, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I'm not trying to deride anybody on the DTC. I'm sure there are plenty of nice people on the DTC, but I just find the RTC to be more accepting. I mean,
so at the local level, should the letter next to your name matter? No,
I don't think so at all. And I think if anyone is the embodiment of that, it's me. I mean, I try to be a reasonable person. I try to be rational. I try to follow the letter of the law. I mean, that's really it. When you're serving on a town board and commission, national politics really very rarely plays into your decision making, especially on something like the Board of Finance, right? I'm not legislating. There's no political legislation that happens. You look at the budget and you say, hey, we have to pass the budget. And then you look at the deltas. You look at where the changes were in the categories that you have control over, right? And if you see something that looks out of place, you question it. That was why I FOIA'd records from David Gronbach. I was looking at the changes. I was looking at the transfers, the interoffice transfers, and there were all these transfers that were just sub $5,000. And I was like, what the heck is going on? $5,000, if no one knows, is the threshold with which the Board of Finance has a vote. So that started to throw up flags. I was like, well, what's going on? And I asked nicely, and I asked in his office, and I asked the director of finance, and I sent emails, and I had to get pushy in order to get the information that I was looking for.
So the FOIA requests weren't the first step; it was the last resort.
No, it was months before I did a FOIA request. I mean, that was, and then it was a month until I got a response.
Yeah. So that relationship, I think, is something that we're probably going to have to get into tonight. And we'll save that for just a moment, because one of the other commissions that you served on was the Charter Revision Commission. And I think this is a really important conversation to have, because first things first, our Charter Revision Commission wasn't assembled until a very long time after we were legally obliged to actually assemble it. So it had been a long time since the charter had seen any revisions, had seen any real oversight. And one of the major areas of focus in terms of the actual effects are things that I think directly relate to the Board of Finance. So for folks who watched the Diane Clafe interview last night, sorry if this sounds somewhat redundant, but Joe was on the board, on the CRC, so was Diane. It affected tremendously the Board of Finance. They're both running for seats, and they're both on the Board of Finance. So if this sounds redundant, I don't know what to tell you, folks. We have to ask these questions. So, Joe, first things first, did you catch my interview with Diane Clafe? Because that'll kind of save some of the redundancy.
I did a little bit. Yep.
All right. So at the time, there were a whole bunch. So one of the things that Joe and I have made an effort to do is to try to debunk some myths, and we're going to get into a myth that I subscribe to, that Joe actually convinced me was actually a myth, by just simply telling me to research it, and I did, and I tried to research it to prove him wrong, and we're going to get into what that myth is, because it's a really hard pill to swallow.
I'm excited, because I don't very often change your mind, Mike.
You changed my mind by insisting that I go out and do the research, and I did, and I was wrong. So. But at the time,
changed my mind on sport budgets, but we'll get into that later, I'm sure.
Yeah, at the time, there was a lot of myths being bandied about, and you and I basically went on a campaign trail, if you will, and we're really the most vocal people about dispelling these myths. So you want to talk about some of what those myths were about the Charter Revision Commission's recommended revisions, and what they actually were?
I'm not sure what myths there were. I know one of the big things that we talked about was, I guess there were a few different things. I mean, they wanted to combine the planning and zoning commissions, which I'm not 100% opposed to. I mean, they handle a lot of the same sorts of paperwork. I understand that, having the bifurcation is nice, right? I mean, anytime you have, a check to a balance, or, more than one group of people making a decision. I think that's, in a governmental capacity, is always better. There was the town manager versus the mayor. I was definitely against that. I don't think that we should have
Were you against it from the start, or were you against it after you guys did some homework?
Both. Actually, both. I was a little bit more open to the idea at the beginning, but as I did my own research and I read some of the information that was presented to us, I started to see that the biggest problem is if you have a town manager, they're an employee, and if they're setting a particular set of policies, right, you have to deal with them as if they're an employee, right? Whereas if you have a rogue mayor, if whoever gets elected mayor goes off the rails and starts doing a bunch of stuff we don't want,
then 2 years later you have a new mayor.
Yeah, two years later you can get him out. I mean, you only have to ride the horse, for so long before you can jump off. So that was one of the things. And then another thing was there were some tweaks that were made to the powers of the Board of Finance. And none of it was that drastic. I mean, we don't have line item control, right? I mean, I wanted to bring back line item control. That was something that I was advocating for. I think that it would be very helpful for the Board of Finance to be able to actually directly adjust the budget in our review. People always ask us to do that, but we can't. We just have buckets, right? We have capital investment, we have personnel. There's 5 buckets that we can control, and then the major overall budget for the schools. And that's it. I mean,
did you agree with the recommendation to bifurcate the Board of Education and municipal budgets at referendum?
I did vote for it. I am still hesitant because I do think that there is a place for, I think people, when they're voting on a budget, vote on 2 things, right? There's people who really know what they're into and want the school board budget to be higher, right? But I don't think that that's most of the people that vote on the budget. I think in the years where we see a huge turnout, I think that's the thing, right? I think a lot of people either get they have we really want to get the school board budget passed because we really want to pass this big number. We really want to cut the town budget or whatever it is. But I think overall people vote on their taxes, on the mill rate. I mean, at least I do, and I kind of trust that the people who are making the decisions as to how big each budget is going to be, that they know that that's what they're going to do. I mean, again, historically, I mean, now I guess I do have kind of some control there, but I tend to vote on the overall number, whether my taxes are going to go up or go down or stay flat, and how much I have in my budget. So
there were some other tweaks that you mentioned. Did the charter revision recommendations as a whole generally make it easier or harder to avoid sending things to referendum?
I don't think it made things easier or harder in sending things to referendum. I mean, there is some issues with timelines. I mean, that's the biggest thing, is that there are statutory limitations.
Let's be clear. Did it make it easier or harder to avoid sending things to referendum?
To avoid. I mean, yeah, because if the town budget passes, right, because we vote on them separately anyway. If the town budget passes, right, now we don't have to do a referendum on that. Or vice versa, the Board of Ed budget passes, we don't have to, we only have one basket to tweak.
So those threshold changes, as far as the monetary threshold changes for things like Board of Finance oversight, things like sending things to a referendum when you have things like not necessarily sales of property, but when expenditures.
Oh, I see what you're talking about. You're not talking about the budget referendum. I'm talking
about the recommendations as a whole.
Yeah, we lowered the threshold. It was, I forget, I'd have to look back at the notes, and I always get this mixed up. It's 1/5 of a mil or 1/8 of a mil. But what ends up happening is because of how the charter is written, right? When you're looking at a percentage of a mill, right? So let's say if we're talking about, like, I don't know, just for sake of numbers, right? If our budget's $1,000, right? And this year we go, okay, if we're going to have an expenditure that's over, 10%, right? So if it's over $100, we have to have a referendum, right? And it's not anything like that. And we're talking about like 1/5 of a mil, right? It's like a minuscule amount, but just again, for the sake of argument, $100. But then, like, next year our budget goes up, right? And the next year our budget goes up. The next year, and before we know, we have a $2,000 budget, right? So now, in order to send something to a referendum, of the taxpayers, right? Now your expenditure has to be 200 of those dollars, right? Which comparatively is the same, but the number has become astronomical, right? So what we did is we lowered that threshold, so that both the number of individual expenditures and the aggregate over 12 months, because that's how it works. So it's, again, like I think it's like a couple of $100,000 overall, like 1/8 of a mil in a single time expense, or 1/5 of a mil. Again, I'd have to reference the charter and look at specifically what they are, and then look at what it is of a mil, right? I mean, all those things are
yeah. The numbers actually change with
changing.
every year. So,
Yeah,
so since we've already had this conversation with Diane, and you saw the conversation, is there anything you'd like to add about your experience with the CRC and what those revision recommendations were, and what your thoughts are on those recommendations?
No, I didn't really. There wasn't a whole lot that really needed to be changed. I mean, even in retrospect and looking at it, there was there was a little bit of clarification that needed to be made around legal matters, like we were talking about appointing someone to town council. That was another one that kind of got me in the ribs, because we had someone who was appointed to town council, and then when they were originally seated, it was only supposed to be up until the election, and they tried to extend it beyond the election. There was all this stuff around there, and I do understand the fairness, and like, if you're appointed to a seat, you should be appointed to that seat until someone supplants you. So we clarified that. That was something that was discussed. I did like the ability to give the Board of Finance not direct oversight. We don't have necessarily direct oversight. We have the ability to recommend investments. That was another big sticking point for me. We had a director of finance who, invested a whole bunch of money in funds, and that wasn't necessarily the best move for the town. At least in my opinion, it wasn't the best move for the town. And I don't think any one individual should be able to invest, millions or tens of millions of dollars of the town money. Not that I think that anyone's going to intentionally do anything that's terrible, but I always like to have, anytime you're dealing with other people's money, right, two sets of eyes on it, Mm-hmm. There's been plenty of times being in business, especially as a carpenter, where I ask the guys that I'm working with, like, hey, what do you think? They could be working for me. It could be a helper. And I'm, setting something up, doing some tile, doing some trim. And I'm like, hey, buddy, what do you think? It's sometimes it's just nice to have an outside opinion. And when you're dealing with investments, why not have 3 or 4 sets of eyes on it? I mean, the only detriment that I see is dynamism, right? Someone who's a sole manager of those funds can be more dynamic, and if there's a rapid change that has to happen, right? But we don't live in an age where no one's reachable. So there are, there are valves and things that could be triggered, or we could do, a committee vote, via email if we had to, or, have a last minute meeting or something like that. I mean, there's lots of ways that we can get around some of those constraints if there's something that is really hugely to the town's benefit that we want to act on very rapidly.
So to that respect, then, as far as multiple eyes on a thing being a good thing, what do you see as the general role of the Board of Finance?
The general role of the Board of Finance is to ensure that the town can meet its financial liabilities, right? We are the body that sets the mill rate. That is our primary role, is setting the mill rate, right? And to kind of be a check on making sure that a budget is not passed that does not realistically represent the needs of the town, right? And in more than one way, right? You don't want a department to end up with a whole bunch of extra money and then constantly be taking that money and transferring it around. That's why we have oversight on transfer over $5,000. And we make sure that the use of the funds is appropriate, right? The town has some special funds like the landfill settlement fund, and we want to make sure that when we're using those funds, we're using them in accordance with the ordinance or the laws that created them. So we want to make sure that we're not taking money out of the pension fund to pay for balloons or hose bibs, or I don't know. What would you think?
So why should the Board of Finance be the board that provides that check?
Well, this is an argument that's been made, and I've heard people, and specifically people who are actually running for the Board of Finance, tell me that they feel that the Board of Finance is a vestigial organ of a time long gone, a time long past, right? We're not necessarily needed per se, right? Because we have town council, a body of 9 that's voting on the same things that then come to the Board of Finance. However, I think that it's nice to have the legislative arm, right, and the financial arm of the government separated, kind of like we have like the roles of the Senate and the House of Representatives, right? The Senate is really more has a specific role, right, representing the individual states, and they're more legislative, right? Whereas the popular vote, the representatives, are the House of Representatives, and they have the ability to tax and spend. What that gives us is that you don't end up with massive, drastic changes to the fiscal policy of the town simply by accident, right? So if the mayor and town council flip in a year from one political party and one group of people, since they're all elected positions, to another group of people, right? You could have people who maybe don't understand or don't know, and that could put the town in a tough spot. You know, if financial decisions are made that could poorly affect our credit rating, or that put us in an odd spot with, I don't know, other legal requirements that the town might have at the time. And as a result, you have the Board of Finance that has 4-year terms, right? Overlapping 4-year terms, right? So you have this financial continuity that's not necessarily seen in the town council, which every 2 years, the entire body is up for election. Same thing with the mayor.
So is that something that was looked at with the Board of with the Charter Revision Commission recommendations then? That's the fact that councilmen are only 2 years and are not staggered, and the fact that the Board of Finance is 4-year seats that are staggered.
Yeah, we actually discussed there's a whole slew of things that were discussed. I mean, like giving the mayor like a 4-year or a 6-year term, or the council a longer term, and trying to figure out ways around these sorts of things. And we just kind of figured that it was, at least me personally, my feeling was that I kind of like it the way that it is. I mean, it makes sense. You have the legislative body that's more dynamic, right? You want the legislature, the laws, the policy positions to change more rapidly than your financial positions, right? You want to keep an open mind, right? But you don't want to go out and just like blow your money every 2 weeks, right? I mean, that's, you know what I mean? Like,
so is there like a special expertise that you would expect for somebody who is seated to the Board of Finance?
That's an interesting, it's an interesting thing.
Let me clarify just a little bit. I asked a similar question last night with Diane, where the question that I asked her was, it's the only body that I can think of, the only elected office that I can think of that has an academic field, course of study in its name.
Yeah. I think it takes a certain personality, but I don't know that I would say that there's more of a set of skills than there is an individual, the person has to be, there's a certain set of skills that you would want, but I don't necessarily know that there's like a specific degree that I would expect someone to have.
Or a credential.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know necessarily, like, not the Board of Finance, maybe finance director, of course. Yeah, I mean, you have to, you're dealing more with your, gap accounting and all of that sort of stuff. And I think you have to have an understanding of that, right? Municipal finance and municipal accounting. I mean, I took courses on that in college. Which definitely helped, but it was interesting because one of the very first things I did is try to figure out what metrics you would apply to a town to figure out their fiscal health, right? Because it's really a hard thing to do because it's so dynamic, right? I mean, people come and they go, and the tax base changes, and grand lists change on a yearly basis, and like, how come the mill rates change? What does the mill rate even relate? Like, it was like all of these thoughts that went through my head that I had never really sat down and thought through an application. I mean, it's one thing to sit down and take a test, right? And and take an accounting test and be able to put your money where it's supposed to be and come out with the right numbers at the end, or I don't know, figure out an option spread or something like that, right, on paper.
Oh my God.
It's a whole nother thing to do it, right?
Yeah. We could put people seriously to sleep with that if we get with that type of a conversation,
right?
Projecting option spreads. Yeah.
I wasn't headed in that direction. I'm just kind of, I'm talking through my thought process, right? Because I don't have a firm answer for you, to be honest. Like, because what I think of is, like, I could look at somebody and have a conversation with them and say, hey, that guy's he ran a construction company, but like, hey, he's a great guy to be on the Board of Finance because he's got that mindset. And then I know some guys who run their own businesses, and I'm like, I would never want that guy dealing with my municipal finance or finance in general, right? But they run their business perfectly fine, right? I mean, they run a very successful business, and maybe businesses that were much larger than my own. So I think it's more of a personality type, right? Because there is a certain amount of like an attorney would be a great person, right? Because we do deal a lot with the law and the legal ramifications of spending one particular bucket of money or transferring it to another bucket of money. And those are the sorts of things that are discussed at some of the meetings. But at the same time, would I say that a hairdresser is boldly uncredentialed to be on the Board of Finance? I don't think I would say that.
All right. I mean, you mentioned an attorney. There is actually an attorney running for this office right now. So, yeah, there is. So, one of the key things that the Board of Finance does, and we've talked about this, we've hinted at this, we've alluded to this, is as an element of oversight of the building of and development of the annual budget. This is probably the only topic when it comes to the Board of Finance you're going to run into every single year. And we talked about this with Diane Clafe last night, where we had a real focus on the municipal side of the budget. So, Joe, tonight with you, I want to focus a little bit more on the Board of Finance's role and how you guys have overseen the top end, at least, because you only get the large number from the Board of Education. So, first things first, let's just get this out of the way. Since I've been asking everybody who's come on, why not ask another Board of Finance member, has the Board of Education budget ever been cut?
No. I've gone back and I've looked back. The farthest back I've gone, I think it's 2005. There were a couple of years in there where the budget was pretty much flat. There might be an increase of, hundreds of thousands, right? Not in the millions. But I have not found a year where the Board of Ed budget was ever negative. Ever.
So to that respect, you've actually had a post out on Facebook that has been making the rounds, and it's been highly popular among certain ranks, and it seems to be a rebuttal of a letter to the editor written by Tom O'Brien. Do you want to talk about the content of that post? Because again, it's a pretty lengthy post. We talked about it on this show. You can find it on Joe DeGregorio's campaign page, which maybe you want to plug while you answer this question. So, do you want to talk about this post, the impetus for it, and then the content that backs it?
Sure. I'll start by saying that do you mind if I just touch on the Board of Finance budget real quick and what we do, just so you could kind of get the idea of how I came up with this, what I was doing, right? Just so you understand my thought process a little bit, because sometimes it's easier to understand what's going on if you understand how someone thinks more than just the bottom line of what they're saying, right? So with the Board of Finance budget, we don't have line item control. We don't have line item control over the Board of Ed.
So hold on,
right?
Let's be very specific here. You're talking about the budget that is presented to the Board of Finance and their role and duty and their capabilities within that presentation. Yeah.
We have 5 buckets. I'd have to look up what all 5 are. I always forget what they are, but I know that it's contractual obligations, capital investments, personnel. I always forget what the other ones are, but I'll circle back around to that. I'll make sure we touch on it. I actually have a spreadsheet, and it auto categorizes it for me, so I kind of forget sometimes. But I don't ignore the line items, right? You can't ignore them, because sometimes you have to look a little bit deeper than what you're given, right? The director of finance always likes to give me just the 5 categories. We get the whole budget too, right? But when we're discussing the budget, he always gives us the 5 categories. Not he likes to, it's what he does. He gives us the 5 categories so that's what we can discuss off of, because that's where we can make changes. And we could see how that changes the mill rate and the overall budget as we're going through. But just changes in those 5 categories don't necessarily indicate anything, right? We could hire an extra guy and all of a sudden, personnel budget goes up 50, 100,000, 200,000, whatever it is, right? So you kind of have to drill down and look a little bit deeper. Sometimes we'd have, especially with transferring the municipal budgeting system from one computer system to another, a bunch of the categories changed, right? So we had one year, I remember we had $1.4 million in categorized reductions, right? But we had it was $900,000 in categorized reductions, but we had $1.4 million in categorized increases, right? Because that's one way to look at the budget, is where, I like to have all my line items set up, and then I can trigger, a color code of whether they've gone up or they've gone down, right? To see what's actually changing. If we reduced personnel, okay, well, where have we reduced it, right? Which part of the budget? So what I did with the Board of Ed budget is I kind of did the same sort of analysis, where you look at the overall budget as a yearly change, as an annual change, right? If you don't mind, I'm just going to pull it up on my phone real quick so I don't forget and I don't misspeak as far as what the numbers were on that. Hold on one second here. All right. So So it was a 10-year period, and the article was actually titled, let's see, it was
The article you were, hold on, the article you were responding to.
The article that I was responding to was one of the News Times. It was Hine would be the mayor for all in New Milford. I think the author was Tom O'Brien, and the person that signed it was Tom O'Brien. And he said Pete Bass consistently voted to defund our schools. I mean, what's the implication of that, right? Like, it's like you're saying that he's taking money away from the school district. Well, like that's not even nearly close what happened, especially when you look at it over the course of 10 years, right? Every year during the decade from 2010 to 2020, the Board of Ed proposed lean budgets that barely kept up with inflation, and Mr. Bass and his Republican cohorts took a buzzsaw to them, right? I mean, like that he's trying to elicit an emotional response, right? So I actually went back and I looked at it, and he started at the year 2010. I wasn't sure if he was talking about 9-10 or 10-11. So I started with 9-10 to today, because that's realistically, right? Like that's probably what he's talking about, but it's hard to see because the reporting for this year hasn't come out yet. Audits aren't done, all that sort of stuff, right? But just on a budgetary basis, the adopted budgets increased from 56 million and change, 56.6 million to 65.8 million for fiscal year 21-22, right? Which we're just starting now. That's a 16.236% increase over 12 years, or 1.35% annually. It's not great. But if the rate of inflation on average is 1.7%, right, just shy of 2%, we're not tracking inflation all that poorly, right? I mean, especially when you're considering, the school district has been shrinking. We closed the school as a result in 2015, that the Board of Ed actually voted to close, not the town. The town had nothing to say about that. The Board of Ed was in control. It was a Board of Ed property. The Board of Ed has full control of their properties when they're there. And that's another interesting thing, because a lot of the Board of Ed capital repairs actually fall on the town anyway. So in addition to paying the Board of Ed budget, right? What if we added in the roofs for, never mind the high school. I think we did Sarah Noble and Scatticoke, and we've been going around. We did oil tanks at some of the schools, right? The East Street building was part of that. There were repairs that had to get done there as a result of water infiltration. And over the years, there's been all sorts of stuff. I mean, there were ADA requirements that for the high school that weren't completed until they did the turf fields, and all of that stuff was extra to the budget, really. Some of it was with capital reserves, that would have come back to them at the end of the year anyway. But some of it was bonded. So that should all be part of the conversation, but just on a budgetary basis, 1.35%. But
so
I really,
since we're running out of time here, Joe, so what is the end result of all of this? Because we have to couple that with knowing that enrollment has significantly declined over that period as well.
Right. So I was just getting there. Sorry, I can be long-winded, and I apologize. We wanted to look at a 10-year period, so I went back and I took 8-9 to 18-19, and I did that actually in reverse, because what I did is I went on the state's website. It's edinsight.ct.gov. Anyone can go on there. You can look at all the demographic data for the schools. Some of it is actually blocked out. I don't know why, but if you go on there, in terms of I don't know, genders and races and all that information's on there as well. So you can really get a good look at what New Milford looks like demographically at the school level, which is really cool. But the most recent data was 2018-19 year. And so I went back 10 years before that, right? So on a clean and audited basis, right? The actual complete budgets. Let's see. What was it? I'm trying to read through what I wrote there, so I don't forget. I'm looking at my notes. So I chose the actual expenditures because they're the most accurate provided by the towns, right? So that would be like the end of the year's numbers, right? That are printed in a budget, in a subsequent budget. For 8-9, that was 56.8 million, 9-10, 62.4 million, right? And that's actually a 9.75% increase, again, just shy of 1% over 10 years, 1% year over year. But that's not actually the total expenditures. The state actually kicks money into the schools. Some of the money goes to the schools that doesn't go through the budget, right? So Ed Insight actually has on there the actual total expenditures on the state budgetary basis, right? What they consider. And for that, it was like 60 million to 66.1, right? Which is 9.07% increase. So it's a slightly lower increase. But over that same period of time, the school lost 916 students, or 18.8% of its total student population.
So what does that work out to per student then?
It works out to a 33.89% increase per student. The per student spending from 2008-9 went from $12,000 per student to $16,325 per student. And I have to tell you, I mean, over that period of time, if you really look at the overall data for the town of New Milford, we really were floating, in the bottom of the pack in terms of per student spending around 2010. Now we're kind of like in the middle, So we've actually increased our spending up to a level that is more average for the state.
So actually that transitions us to our hard pill to swallow conversation here. In just 1 second, we'll get into that momentarily. But since we are running a bit late, since we were running a little bit late to get it started, Joe, do you mind hanging out with us for another 5 or 10 minutes?
I don't mind. Whatever you want to do, man.
All right. So that's what we'll go over by a little bit, folks, since we got a little bit of a late start. So, Joe, that kind of takes us to the hard pill to swallow here, which was something that I think we're going to elucidate here in this conversation just by questioning it. So by increasing the amount of money that we've spent, have we actually per student, not only in absolute terms, but in relative terms relative to all of these other districts, has that resulted in any meaningful increase or improvement in educational outcomes here in New Milford?
I don't know. I mean, again, like 2010, I had just moved here, right? I moved here in I think 6, 7, like that year.
Does it generally?
I don't know. I think I know our school ratings have gone up, but
those ratings aren't based on actual educational outcomes. I'm sure you're aware of that.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I don't know. I know that the number one driver of a student's success in school, educational in general, is parental involvement, right? Like every night at dinner, I ask my kids, "What did you do at school?" Right? I want them to know that I have little kids. They're little guys, but I want them to know that I'm interested. I want them to know that we can talk about it. We discuss what they did in history class or science class or gym class. Doesn't really matter. I just want to be there, and I want to be, part of that, and we really try to focus on reading, I mean, that was a big thing through the pandemic. We tried to get my son reading and, my daughter reading and writing. I mean, she just wrote effectively a 10-page novel, a little novella, short, long story or something, and she's still in grammar school.
So, okay, then. So then that kind of speaks to homeschooling, the explosion in homeschooling that's been happening. We're going to we're going to circle back to how this relates to the building of the Board of Finance, the budget through the Board of Finance process and at these meetings, and Joe, what you think of all of that. But what does the explosion in homeschooling that's been taking place tell us about public schools?
I don't know. This is one thing that I've struggled trying to figure out, right? Homeschooling is hard, man. It's hard. You have more than one kid, it's hard, through the pandemic. I'm sure everyone saw me grow long hair and a beard, and I mean, part of that was like trying to work and help my wife teach the kids, and then I'm working on my house and trying to learn a new skill and all these sorts of things. But like homeschooling was a major part of that, man. I mean, it's a lot of work. You got the kids 24 hours a day. My wife was a superstar. She was a trooper. I mean, doing curriculums effectively for 3 kids, right? I mean, a second grader, a kindergartner, and a preschooler. I mean, it was crazy trying to make sure that they all can read at some sort of level, and then trying to find it's tough, man. So I don't know. I mean, I think those parents are super soldiers if they can handle it. That's because I had a hard time with it. Do I think that that's a result of the coronavirus, masking, the fact that Connecticut happens to be a state that is very lenient in terms of its homeschooling rules, right? I mean, in terms of parental reporting, I mean, we could see an increase in homeschooling simply because people are moving to Connecticut, right, to be able to homeschool because they were living in New York and they don't want to send their kids to the crappy public schools there. I mean, who knows? I mean, I'm sure there's some of that going on. Not that New York's public schools are crappy, but I'm just saying maybe they thought they were or something. I don't know. I think that I would like to see stronger information that an increase of spending double the rate of inflation had a great impact on the Board of Education. That would be interesting to me. I'd like someone to give me some sort of convincing information that would say, hey, over the last 12 years, right, we've literally put more than double the rate of inflation on a per pupil basis into the school district, closed the school, right? All these sorts of things. And this is the outcome. This is the result. Look, we're now graduating our kids with the ability to do math at a higher level than the average of the state, right? I mean, but I'm not seeing any compelling evidence that way, right?
So this is actually where we're going with this hard pill to swallow. Is Joe and I had this conversation years ago, and I was like, no, there's no way that's not true. That can't be true. The more you spend on a per pupil basis, the more you spend on public education, the greater your outcomes you're going to get, the better your educational outcomes are going to be. And then what I did was Joe, you were the one. Yeah, Joe, you told me to look into this, and I was like, oh, I'm going to do this to disprove Joe. And it turns out from my research, it turns out that what I saw is that no, there is no correlation between overall spending on public education K through 12 and educational outcomes. By the way, if you're watching on YouTube, I have a video on that on my YouTube channel. It's called "The Truth About Spending in Public Schools: What Works and What Doesn't." Guys, check that out. But
it's even more interesting when you look at class size, because one of the things that I always thought was that class size really would have a huge impact on educational outcomes. But what all of the studies that they point to is subjective, right? It's all, how did you feel? Did you feel that you had more time with the teacher? Did you feel that the teacher was able to explain it to you better? And people tend to say yes when it's a smaller class, right? But in terms of actual learning, right, the evidence just isn't there on any metric in terms of, like, standardized testing or, ability to grasp the information and apply it and all those sorts of things. Once you get out of, like, little kids school, right? Like once you get into middle school and high school, I mean, you really could have a lot more students per class than even what the state recommends. And your educational outcomes would not be broadly different. What would make educational outcomes, I feel, right, broadly different would be if we had a parent who was highly involved. We could help the parents to be highly involved in their kids' education. If that means one parent staying home, if that means, having grandma in the house, if that means any of those things, like that's what we should be advocating for, right?
So if you had,
those sorts of things are really what, and again, like when I say community involvement, I don't mean the school supplanting the role of the parent and providing longer hours on the front or the back end, right? Like that's a recipe for disaster, right? That's taking more control away from the parents in terms of rearing their children. We need the parents to be involved, because no one's going to care about your kids more than you do. I mean, I hate to say it, but I really feel that that's the case, right? I mean, like, no one's going to love my kids as much as I do, right? Like no one's going to want the best thing in the world for them. I mean, my mom might, right? Like my mom, but like they're still my kids at the end of the day, So.
Yeah. So again, to that effect, we've talked about competing interests here. Then one of those things you could do to allow people for what you're talking about, for a parent to be able to stay in the home, the huge reason they don't stay home and, with the kids is because they have to work. So if you were to reduce that burden with things like reducing the burden of taxation on these people, then would they be able to then say, all right, now maybe it's worth it. That threshold may be enough, may be reached for it to be worth it to now stay home with my kids. I mean, does this make sense? Does this competing interest make sense here? Would you have the competing interest of the taxing of the residents versus... Yeah.
It's a discussion that I actually have had with my wife many, many times. And this past year we made a hard decision that she's going to have to start working, because, I mean, we can only bear so many years of loss with one income, before, we're financially destitute, it's really difficult, man. It is really a difficult thing to have to say, like, hey, I just can't spend all that time with that little baby, or, you know what I mean? Like what I don't know how parents do it. I mean, like I've been blessed, like having my own business. My wife was a stay-at-home mom predominantly for the last 7 years, it's, and being able to have one parent there for the kids, has really been a godsend. I mean, to get them off the bus, I mean, to help other parents, right? Like, I mean, to help our friends, like, hey, can you guys put our kids on the bus because I got an early day at work tomorrow or something and I can't stay home. I mean, like, having, someone around to be able to do that. But that's, but yeah, it's definitely competing interest, and it is driven entirely financially. And it's not just the property taxes, man. I mean, property taxes definitely drive it, but it's the cost of everything. But I think the cost of everything is as a result of both taxes and insurance, right? I mean, those, I guess insurance is a conversation.
Yeah, that's an entirely separate conversation. But
I can rail against insurance all day long. I mean,
yeah, me too. But the point is, with all of these considerations being made, with all of these things that we've said, with all of these really hard pills to swallow that we've talked about tonight, how does that influence your decision making when you see when it comes to the building of the budget from the Board of Education side, when you see these continuous increases despite significant declines in enrollment?
Well, it's a hard thing. There was one year where I was really railing against the school board budget. I mean, I was on social media. I was at Board of Ed meetings. I was everywhere trying to shake the tree, right? Shake the proverbial tree. And what I found, and this was, I mean, man, I had long conversations with people on the Board of Ed and superintendents and, teachers. And I mean, all sorts of different people regarding the budget, because I really want to get to the bottom of how much do they need, Diane kept using this needs versus wants sort of relationship. And that really is something that you have to consider, because, I mean, we may not want pay to play, right? But on a budgetary basis, the Board of Ed might need pay to play. But I don't think, and I'm using that as an example. It's really a terrible example, because pay to play really is such an insignificant part of a, nearly $70 million budget,
Yeah.
But what it always came down to me was the Board of Ed negotiates these fixed increases on an annual basis, right? So, and this is the thing that gets me, right? It's the thing that gets me. So if you're in negotiations, if you are a Board of Ed person who's negotiating with the teachers union or whatever organization you're negotiating with, and you look back over that 10 years and you go, hey, we've had, what was it, 1.3%? 1.3% increases over, is that what it was? I keep forgetting, an effective 1%, right? If we had a 1.35% annual increase to the budget over the last 12 years, are you really going to sit there and negotiate a 3% increase to anything? Does that just seem crazy to me? Or are you just packaging in aggregate loss to your budget? Right? I mean, understand what I'm saying? Like, if you're budgeting in a fixed increase of 3%, you know that you're only going to get 1.35% more next year, right? But you're budgeting in 3%. It seems kind of odd. It seems like a dereliction of duty, or like, that your budget is going to effectively be cut the following year, right? I mean, am I wrong in making that assumption? I don't know. But I know that personally, I would look at it and I'd say, hey, I know that our capacity is 1.35%, And I'm not saying anyone doesn't deserve a pay raise, or any vendor isn't going to have some sort of fixed cost increase, or that, CL&P isn't going to have an increase. But when you're looking at that, you have to start to think like, maybe we shouldn't be packaging in these 3% fixed costs if we're really concerned with a decrease in services, right? Like,
well, I mean, you spoke to increasing class sizes to save those funds, and how that may or may not actually result in a decrease in outcomes. I've talked about that on this show.
There's plenty of ways. I mean, in one way is when you're looking at an 18% loss in students over the same period, right? We're able to bear 1.35% increases because we've lost 18% of our student body. I mean, that's huge. We went from 4,000 and change to
at peak it was 5,400. It might as well have been 5,000 at peak.
Right. So in 2008-9, the report reported from the state was 4,864, and
it was just a tad higher at peak. So it was basically 5,000.
3,948. I mean, we lost 900 students at 25 students per class. We got 30 classes. Did I get that wrong?
We're at roughly 25. The student to teacher ratio is roughly 25. So it's going to actually work out to more classes, I think, because the way you get to 25 students per class is that in the lower grade levels, which there are fewer students, but there's like the N of below 25 is greater than the N of above 25.
25 students per class, and I might have got this wrong. I just did it on pen and paper. That's 36 classes. So we lost effectively throughout for on a daily basis the need for 36 teachers. Maybe not 36. Yeah, I guess that would be 36 teachers, right? I mean, because they have to be in class somewhere, right?
I mean, that's what your math says. I mean, I'm not sure if that necessarily works out in terms of an operational.
Yeah, I wouldn't know. I leave that to the board. But again, I don't have line item control. I just look at the overall budget, and I think it's kind of odd. And I don't actually, to be honest with you, Mike, I don't think I've ever voted to decrease the Board of Ed budget. I might have presented it one year. I'd have to go back and look at my notes. But I think at the end of the day, every single time we voted to put more money into the school board, and sometimes more than even came across from the town council. Someone had pointed that out, and a lot of the times that's just a result of listening to the people coming out. I mean, again, like I try not to hold ideological feet, my own ideological feet to the fire, right? Because when you're elected to a specific position, you really have to think about who you're serving. And if I'm serving the community and I have 2,000 some odd people on any annual basis that have voted for me, that got me the seat, almost, I forget what it was. I'd have to look back, right? I'm representing not only those people, but really the whole of the community, right? I mean, someone could not vote for me and come up and say, hey, Joe, like really, we need this money for this, So
it sounds like you're describing, there's two ways to look at how to build the budget. From a philosophical standpoint. And one is you build the budget in the way that you think is the best way to build a budget. And then the other way to look at it is to build the budget in a way that is going to most easily pass at referendum, that is going to be most easily be considered favorable to the greatest percentage of voters. So which of those two ideals do you subscribe to?
I tend to look at it on a voter basis, right? And on a prudency basis. You want to be financially, and fiscally prudent. We can't do something. I mean, I could want to cut the budget up and down and get our property taxes down to, North Carolina levels, right? But is that realistic in Connecticut, right? Is that something that's going to put us at risk of, being financially liable for something else, right? I mean, if you're not maintaining your roads, right, or your schools or your buildings, right, there's financial liabilities that come along with that, right? If you don't fill potholes, people complain. Not only are they going to complain, in letters, they're going to complain to the state. They're going to complain, and someone might try to sue the town because their car got messed up because they slammed into a pothole. I mean, who knows, right? I mean, if someone gets hurt at a building because it wasn't properly maintained, right? So we have to be able to fund those sorts of things. What if the ambulance can't get to your house, right? So there's a certain level of financial prudency where you want to look at getting the best budget for the community, the budget that's going to pass. Right. And anytime I look at the budget, right, like my first thought is what is it ideologically that I would like to see? And I advocate for that. Right. I advocate for that to people talking to the different departments. Right. I might go and discuss with Public Works, go in there, talk to some guys. Hey, what's going on? What do you think of your job? They don't have to know who I am. I'm not going to say, I'm Joe from the Board of Finance and I'm looking at the budget. I just talk to them and find out what they want. What's going on? Do you have all the gear that you need, right? Talking to a police officer, talking to people on the ambulance corps, right? Maybe talking to someone at social services. Hey, how's stuff going down over there? Is there anything that you guys need? Are you really feeling a deficit? Is there something that's super important to you that you could use more of, And I think that's really an important way to look at it from a service point of view. And then the flip side of that is you talk to the community and you say, hey, what are you guys feeling? Right. I mean, if people are like, man, we really need to get more cops out on the road because I'm seeing, these crazy speeders going up and down Route 7 because of the congestion, my gut goes, I really don't want to get pulled over. I don't necessarily think that that's a great use for police officers. I might want to see them somewhere else. I'd rather see them dealing with people who are really committing crimes, right? I mean, get the guy who's reckless driving, not the guy who's doing 5 over, And I'm sure most police officers, I would hope would agree with me. I mean, I don't know. They have a job to do too, right?
So you guys basically see the overall number. So then to that effect, as we're kind of wrapping things up here, is there... You do see the line items when it comes to the municipal side of things, and I know that you guys can make recommendations in certain areas. So is there a line item on the municipal side of things that is attracting your attention in the way that you just mentioned?
Nothing
and
really.
Just again, so people get an understanding of what Joe DeGregorio is going to look like come budget season, because that's the first thing you guys are basically going to do after election.
Yeah, there's not a whole bunch that I'm going to say right out of the gate. Until I've looked at the department numbers as they're presented. The last 2 years when I've gone over the budget, I've really felt like I had very little work to do. especially on the town side. And it's not just because there was like a relatively flat number there. The effective tax rate is like minuscule and increase. It's really that the town did a great job of staying, on a budgetary basis year over year, pretty lean and mean, very effective at what they were doing, through COVID and being able to provide the services that the town really needed, but at the same time, keeping the budgetary pain, is that the right way to look at it, right? The tax pain down. And I think that's huge, and it's not just Pete, it's not just the mayor. I mean, it's really all the department heads, all the guys out there doing the work, they've really done a great job. I think my big thing coming into this year is going to want to see some more justification from the board of ed. I mean, honestly, really, on the Board of Finance side, I'm not going to hurt them. I don't want to hurt anybody. I don't want to I'm not going to, try to cut. But I would really like to see, and I'm challenging them now, right? Show me the increases. Show me where all of this additional spending that we've seen over the years has effectuated change. Because what I've heard from the teachers is that they feel like they're not getting pay raises that they deserve, that they've had budgetary freezes over the years, right? Where is this? I really see a lot in the Board of Ed budget, a lot of administrators, and it's not super concerning, but it is at the same time.
I guess what you're saying is maybe there's a rationale. Let's hear it.
Yeah. Well, exactly. I want really to be justified and really focus on it. I mean, and stop, please, Board of Ed people, really stop with you've cut. Your budget has gone up every single year. It's really tiresome. And a request is not, my kids request from me all the time. Daddy, I'm making a request for more cake. No. Well,
I've brought this up. If the Board of Education proposed a request of $100 quadrillion and were approved of $99 quadrillion, would the budget have been cut from $70 million to $99 quadrillion?
No, and the example with my kids was me saying no to you having more cake is me not cutting your cake. It's me saying no to the request for more cake because you have cake.
Yeah. All right. All right. Well, I Joe, thanks for coming on. I know that you do have a campaign page on Facebook. Do you want to plug that for everyone, or are we going to pass on that?
If they want, they can go. I'm not really doing anything with it. It's just, to separate political Joe. I try to keep the political, posting there to a little bit less than on my personal page. But I don't know how successful I am with that because so many of the town pages won't allow political pages to sign on. I think that was the problem that Ted Hine for mayor was having. Was that I think maybe he was trying to comment or something, because I try to do that too. And maybe I just don't know Facebook anymore. They keep changing the interface. I'm kind of over Facebook, to be honest with you. I've taken a couple of hiatuses and I probably should have stayed off.
Well, that was one heck of a plug for your Facebook page. Anyways, Joe, I'm gonna ask you one last question.
Charity. Give to your community. How about that? Can I plug that? Can I plug the great thing about New Milford? The one thing, and I'm going to be 100% honest with you because I've lived all over the country, right? My favorite thing about New Milford is the volunteerism. Seriously, 100%. I mean, I lived in St. Augustine, Florida. We did not see volunteerism like we saw here. I lived in Arvada, Colorado, in Cheyenne, Wyoming, in Laramie. I mean, I've lived all over in New York. And you don't see the level of volunteerism that we have here. And that's really what makes our community strong. I mean, there are so many wonderful organizations doing great for the community. And believe it or not, the fire department, right? Do you know what a fire department would cost the town? It'd be tens of millions of dollars. To have a paid for fire department. We have guys out there every day through COVID, through all this other stuff. I mean, volunteering to put their lives on the line, to put their families at risk. I mean, that's incredible, So how about a plug for them? Their Facebook pages. And when you see the boots out on the street, throw some dollars in there.
There you go. You just created your Academy Award speech there, Joe. That'll be the clip of the night. So, folks, we are going to get into Q&A in just 1 second. So if you guys have questions for Joe, get them into the comments section now. We are going to read them off right to Joe. And, of course, we are free speech absolutists. So on this channel. So anything that you guys, any tough questions that you have, if you think that I wasn't being doing my service here to allow the voters to understand where Joe stands on certain things, and how you would decide when it comes to vote on November 2nd. Get those questions in now. We'll take them from Facebook. We'll take them from YouTube. So if you guys got questions, get them in now, and we'll get into that momentarily. Joe, I did mention that we are free speech absolutists. As the questions are coming in, just your thoughts real quick on are you a free speech absolutist?
Me?
Yeah,
I think so. I mean, yeah. I mean, even yelling fire in a theater, and if it doesn't hurt somebody, I'm free speech 100%. And I can take it. I mean, sometimes I cry. I won't lie. People have said mean things to me, words on Facebook, and it just brought tears to my eyes.
Well, there you go. I mean, that's how you respond to it, right?
That's it.
All right. So let's get into your questions, folks. So Melvin Shaw, you got a quick recap what's going on. That was right at the beginning of the show, Melvin. So just so folks know, I'll go ahead and plug what we're doing interview-wise. So first things first, we did interview Mayor Bass already. I've actually got this all in a playlist on my YouTube channel. So if you guys are watching on Facebook, go ahead and check me out on YouTube. The link is in this video's description. You can go ahead and follow the channel. And there's the playlist for all of the interviews that I have already done and the interviews that I have officially scheduled. I'll keep everybody posted as more interviews get rolled in. But we started with the mayor on a Wednesday night a few weeks ago, and then on 2 weeks ago, I think it was. Anyways, we started our interview with Mayor Bass, so you guys can check that out. That's a 2-hour-long interview. So what I did was I broke that up for everybody into clips, so you guys can go into that playlist too. I created a playlist on Facebook for just those clips if you want to see that 2-hour-long interview in more digestible formats. On Sunday night, we interviewed Eric Hansel, who is running for the Board of Education. And so you guys can check that out. Last night we interviewed Diane Clayford. We had some audio issues. That's true. Yes, but I did upload the recorded version, so you guys can see that with the audio handled audio fix both on my YouTube and Facebook pages. Tonight we're interviewing Joe DeGregorio. We're going to wrap up our interview series Thursday night with Sal Renkowitz, who's running for town council. So we have officially had the mayor. We've had someone who's running for a candidate for Board of Education. We've had 2 candidates for Board of Finance, and we did Mike Nahom on Sunday night. It was Eric Hansel the Sunday night before. So yeah, so we've had a candidate for the town council, and we're going to have another candidate for town council on Thursday night. So we're trying to hit up as many of these boards as we can and get as many candidates as we can. If you are a candidate for elected office here in New Milford, and you'd like to come on the show and have a conversation, again, regardless of party, happy to have you on, just like we do every time. They're all live. We aim for an hour. We're a little bit over today, and we always do your live Q&A. So that is your opportunity to get direct access to the candidates. Again, open invitation to any candidate who's seeking elected office in this election season. Okay. So Melvin Shaw also asks, how do you feel living in this area has shaped you and your family? Great question.
It's made me more conservative.
Really? Just straightforward. That's what it's done. Nothing.
I don't know if it's age or what, but all right. Well, so I would go back someplace warm if I could. I really don't like the winters, I'm not gonna lie.
I'm right there with you, Joe. So that's not, that's understandable.
But it has definitely changed my perspective on, like I said, community involvement. That's a huge one. Involvement of the state in your life. I mean, coming from Florida back up here and running a business in Florida versus running a business up here. I mean, it was like it's hugely different. And interacting with the state can be a bit difficult here. Just more like bureaucratic. But in terms of, I don't know. That's really it. I mean, I really feel like a connection to the community. So that's kind of interesting. I really feel like the people around here are really nice, and that's kind of nice. I mean, I don't know. That's it. Yeah. I think I don't really know how to answer that question besides that. I don't know.
Yeah. So Richie Lathers just says hi to the two of us. So hi, Richie.
Hey, Richie, you still running for council?
Yeah. So Ray says Ray says I already asked his question, but maybe in like a sentence or two, maybe we can just, since we've been here for an hour, for those who are just tuning in, why not just ask this question again? If there's a 1 or 2 sentence answer to this, maybe we can have the people who are probably asking this questions themselves. Ray asked earlier this evening, why did you hop parties?
Well, we kind of went over that. I hopped parties because I was looking for my place. I was looking for my political home. People that I got along with, who I could have conversations with openly, and were accepting of different viewpoints. I struggle with a lot of the political stuff. I think that's one of the reasons that I'm really interested in it, is because I kind of I try to see both sides. It's like I was saying with the budget, right? Like you have to talk to the people, but then you also have to sell the budget, right? So there's like this push and pull. It's the same thing that I kind of feel politically, especially with a lot of the hot button issues, like school funding, right? Like we discussed that, I've been on both sides of that, I've seen the justification for increases, and I've seen the justification for cuts, and I kind of go back and forth. And I had to go through a bunch of different political parties, right, to end up where I am today, and to kind of understand myself a little bit more. And I had to think through all of those issues and all of the different aspects that go into it, right? I mean, something might sound great on the surface, but then when you really start doing some of the thought games, the logical, drawing out root causes and ultimate ends, sometimes it's not what you think, it's like I said, being in a blue state, right, has ultimately made me more conservative. Is it because those ideas are really great, or because I have to deal with more of these more liberal sorts of, or progressive, I don't even know what the word for it is. It's like, party liberal, I don't know, more of these democratic policies where they have a higher involvement in your life, right? Is that ultimately the best thing for everybody? Or like we're saying with having a parent at home, what might it be better if we had less government involvement? Is homeschooling really superior? I don't know. I still don't know. I still don't have answers to those questions, and I'm still trying to kind of go through it. And guys, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to be 100% honest. I may not be a Republican forever. I might find my home somewhere else in 10 years.
Really? Would you ever consider joining the Libertarian Party then?
Well, not at the moment. No.
I tried.
The parties change, and and your thought process changes, right? Like, what do they say? If you're not a Democrat when you're young, you're heartless. If you're not a conservative when you're old, you're a fool. Or something like that. How does that saying go? I don't know.
I haven't heard it, so this is all news to me, Joe.
Yeah.
All right. So that actually ends our questions. So everyone who threw out a question, that was all we got.
Mike, come on, give me another hard one. I was hoping to have one of my haters on, someone with a vendetta. That's I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, the whole point of this is to elucidate the voters as to your perspective on things, so that they know how to vote on November 2nd, and you either convince them to vote for you or you haven't. So that's kind of the way we do things here. But anyways, Joe, thanks for coming on. Everyone at home, thanks for watching so much. I appreciate it quite a bit. I always love the questions you guys come up with. And just one more chance to say thanks, Joe, for coming on.
Thanks, Mike, for having me.
Guys,
we're doing this. Fun. I mean, really, this is a great thing that you do.
Yeah.
It's nice to actually hear some of the people talk about the issues.
Yeah. So with that said, folks, thanks for staying tuned with us.